Hello and welcome to the Go to Martech podcast, a podcast dedicated to sharing advice, strategies and insights for go-to-market professionals in the marketing technology space. I'm b.reeder and today I am speaking with Michael Katz, the CEO and co-founder of mParticle. I hope you enjoy.
Great to have you on the pod today, MK. How you doing?
Hello, sir. I'm doing great. How are you?
Yeah, I'm well, thanks. I'm well. I'm worried we've shot ourselves in the foot here a little bit, MK, because for our first episode, we've gone out and got one of the best guests on the market. So it's all downhill from here.
You either have a great guest or you have the greatest guest, and time will tell.
Glad we're aligned. Okay, fantastic. Well, perhaps to kick things off, MK, you could kind of start just by giving us and our listeners a bit of an intro, really, into your background, your career journey so far, and how you got where you are today.
Sure. I'll cover off pretty much on the last 20 years. Started an ad tech company called Interclick. We had a kind of a bit of a wild ride. I'll spare some of the juicier details, but we were able to take the company public. Subsequently, it was bought by Yahoo back in 2011. So saw it go from really nothing, and we were bootstrapped for the first, let's say, 5 or so years of the business. So not a ton of room to pursue like interesting things. It was really about kind of like brass tacks business building. And I think one of the things that we saw along the way there was like as our learning curve started to flatten out, our growth curve started to accelerate. So those things were kind of inversely related. And so watched it go from like an idea to a small business to an industry leader to seeing it go public and being bought to watching it die a slow, painful death. A much bigger organization. So I got a really strong appreciation for like the entire life cycle of a company. The thing at Interclick was like, while not every day was an easy day by any means, like we never really had a bad quarter. Like everything, this is going to sound kind of cliche, but like everything was pretty much up and to the right. Partly because we had a great team, we had great technology, but like partly because like based on a number of things, we had kind of backed ourselves into a corner. We had no other way of operating, right? And when I say that, I mean like we had gone public really early. We're a micro cap publicly traded company, which is defined as any company worth under $1 billion in terms of total market capitalization. So Wall Street's not very forgiving if you start to miss numbers, right? So everything had to be really dialed in. And so, you know, I bring this up because as I started mParticle, which is the company that I've been running now for the past 11 years, I look back and I actually thought that I knew anything about entrepreneurship and running a company. And now, like the mParticle journey's been like basically the exact opposite of the Interclick journey. Interclick didn't start with a vision; it just started with like seeing an opportunity and running after it. mParticle started with like a very kind of clearly defined vision with a 10-year strategy. So everything that we've been doing, like you can open up some of our earliest slide decks and PowerPoints, and they are ugly as all hell, but like we haven't really deviated. Like we've got better at telling the story and up-leveling the narrative, but everything that we set out to do has been exactly what we've been doing. The other kind of big difference between the two was like, you know, I mentioned Interclick never had a bad quarter. When you're in an established category and you're really just competing based on like the merits of the, I guess, team and technology, that's a lot different than trying to build a new solution or bring a new solution to market, which ends up creating, if you've identified the right market opportunity, a category. And so with that comes just like a lot more unpredictability. In the early days, we were having to try to convince people that they had problems that they were not even aware of, right? And then you kind of get into this, like, some people would get it and they'd have like the oh crap moment, and then they would get excited. You have other people that are like, what are you talking about? You could just tell, like, the kind of blank stare, and how you would try to navigate those things. And just it created much more of this like emotional roller coaster. But I would say, like, this business over the course of the past 11 years, I mean, we started a company that ended up building a category, and now we're in the process of trying to bring everybody along and reimagine that category, because that category in many ways has become like fully commoditized. So now it's like starting to map back to what we saw at interclick, because we had like literally 400 different competitors, 400 different ad networks, and now there's 100 and something CDPs out there. So the two experiences have been kind of wildly different, but I would say, like, most of what I have learned about being an entrepreneur and a CEO has come from the time at mParticle.
Amazing. Yeah, it's crazy the difference between having a plan at the start and not having a and I'm interested in tackling kind of culture as one of the themes on this conversation, and I'd be interested to know, on both of those journeys, really, like, how did that change as the companies continued to scale through those stages, and was there any parts of culture that were still there on the final day that had been there since day one?
Yeah. So yeah, I'll answer in a second, but I'll just preface it by saying, like, everything is kind of context specific. And so at interclick, I don't think that we set out to define a culture the way that we did at mParticle. I think a lot of my views on culture building and optimization did come from just like observing the culture being formed at interclick. So I think, like, at interclick, like, it wasn't an overly scientific approach. It was like attire young, smart, hungry, sometimes, like, with regard to sales, good looking people, and like good things will happen. For kind of like the ride that we had, I think that made sense. Like, the advertising industry is very relationships oriented. There's not a ton of solution selling. We couldn't have done that, I think, in mParticle, nor, I think, after operating interclick for 7 years, would we want to do that. I feel like one of the things that we learned is, like, culture can be formed. Culture is the collective personality of the organization in its entirety, right? And by setting your value system, setting it and implementing it as early as, like, during the hiring process, you can start to define, like, who comes in to the org, right? Like, depending on how good you are at, like, adhering to those to, like, value-based hiring practices, you can naturally assemble a type of culture that you want. I think the kind of unspoken truth is, like, every startup has the same 5 set of values. They're just usually articulated differently. They're implemented slightly differently with more kind of less consistency. But ultimately, you're still looking for people that have, like, high agency, and looking at people that take accountability, people who are obviously, like, results oriented, people who seek the truth. They're willing to make bets. Like, you can't just exist to avoid risk. Like, you actually have to take bets along the way, and a few other things. But, like, the kind of key point is, like, how well you implement those things into your hiring process. will ultimately dictate the culture that you have. And so for us in the earliest days of mParticle, the culture was just like survive, like do not die. And that was like the source of a ton of anxiety in the early days. It was like, okay, do not let down the people that have all invested in you millions and millions of dollars. Like, do not become a disappointment to them, right? Starts to open up like childhood scars and shit. But like, it's like survive, right? There's kind of this Maslow's hierarchy of needs, and like the kind of shelter and water being like the most basic one. Like that's what it is at a startup. Like, just survive. Don't worry about scalability. Don't worry about the trail of broken glass that's probably going to be created. Like, you will be able to kind of clean that up after the fact. So after like the next fundraise, essentially, like do whatever you can to get from your seed stage to your Series A. From the Series A, it starts to get a little bit more well defined, but from like the A, it's really about like revenue traction, and then at the B it was like efficient revenue traction, and then at the C it started to go like full P&L, and then like at the Series D and beyond, it's like unit economics and how are they trending and what are the levers. And so, it ends up getting very much dialed in over the course of time. But if you're not kind of constantly evaluating the culture that you have and the values that inform the culture along the way, you may find yourself in a spot where you've outgrown the things that help make you successful, and now you may experience those things having a counterproductive effect. So like for us, it was like in the early days, it was like just get shit done, right? You get to a certain point where like enough shit has gotten done, and the company's got big enough, and you've hired a bunch of people, and then it like how you do stuff starts to matter. So there needs to be an evolution of values, and I think that there's two schools of thought. Values are either like carved in stone on day one, and you never deviate from them, which is not my view. I think in my view is more like look at them every 18 months, every 2 years, and say, based on the context that we're in, are these values representative of like the team that we have, the team that we need, and the things that we know we need to do in order to compete and win?
Yeah, absolutely. You're right. I think it's people always use the cliche of like, oh, it's a fast-paced environment, but that's for a reason. Things change quickly and progress quickly. And yeah, I agree. You need to adapt and look at culture as a living, breathing thing, really. So you said to me in the past that all problems are people problems. So what do you think are some of the sort of biggest challenges that are there when it comes to bringing good people into your business, and what do founders kind of get wrong sometimes in that process?
Oh my God. I mean, so much. I mean, first I'll clarify the point. No matter what industry you're in, what technology you're building, who your customers are, people are at the center of everything. No great sales pitch gets created without great people. No amazing solution gets built without great people. It doesn't get brought to market effectively, right? So at the end of the day, most of management is about like decoding and debugging human behavior. Because like as humans, like we're not always completely rational. We're also very much emotional, right? But at the same time, like we don't come with operating manuals, right? Like there's no kind of like label on the side to show like what you're getting into. So you kind of have to figure that out. And I think like like there's a number of different ways to approach that and different frameworks. That's kind of not the point. The point is more just like even if temporarily there's a bug in the software, there's a down quarter, because the sales team isn't like it's all just like people. You know, as a as a as a leader, as a CEO, it's also not only like all problems are people problems. Like you also have to embrace the fact that like everything is your fault, right? Because culture does come top down, right? Like we do get like disproportionate amount of credit for kind of whatever reason, but we also get a proportionate amount of blame relative to kind of the credit. I mean, culture flows top down. I'm often thinking about like, are the behaviors that I'm exhibiting, do I want people to mimic them? And sometimes I do things that are deliberately unpredictable to kind of create like future equity in whatever kind of message I'm trying to deliver. But like, if I don't, so if I don't behave, perform, show up the right way, how can I expect anybody else to? And if I don't hire the right team, how do I know that they're going to hire the right team? And how do I know that those people are going to hire the right team? I think some of the pitfalls that I've seen executives fall into, the number one is overemphasizing their functional silo. So the sales leader who only cares about sales and doesn't understand that, well, sales is selling a product. So I should probably build a relationship with the product team. Sales is reliant on marketing. So I should probably start to understand how marketing works. And same thing across the org. Like if you're in product, well, it's not enough to just to build product. You have to understand and be deeply invested in how the product gets commercialized, right? Or else, like, what's the team doing? If you're building stuff that people don't want to buy, it's kind of a crappy business, right? So you have to find executives that think in systems, right? They think about the interlock and the interconnection between the different functions within the org to produce what everybody is there for, which is like company success and an appreciation of the value of the equity that's been granted, right? So that's first one. Not understanding the market, or the competitive dynamics or the customer needs is another big one. Maybe they've come from like a different space, like for us, maybe somewhere else in software, and they're like, okay, I can pattern match. I know what worked at this other company. Like, I don't really need to learn all those things. It's like a hammer and nail approach. Not taking the time to learn the technology, like the actual solution and how it impacts both the customer experience as well as the employee experience. That's a huge sin I've seen. We just talked about like culture and cultural dynamics. Like, does the executive understand the cultural dynamics and the kind of like political dynamics? Every organization has some bit of politics, even the organizations that have kind of a no BS policy for politics, like that itself, the politics, right? And then you get into some of the more kind of context specific things. It's like, can the executive actually handle stress, right? Like, one of the things I've seen is like, you bring in some of these like big company executives, and yeah, they understand how things work at scale. But like, if you're coming from a massive company, the threat of like imminent death is non-existent, right? Like, in startups, in small companies, one person can make or break the company, right? So like, everything kind of is somewhat existential. And then, I'd say a part and parcel with that is like, do they have the job specific, like functional maturity to identify and then successfully do the most important thing at that time, because at different times that thing is gonna vary, right, widely, right? And oftentimes what you see is executives can go wide, but they can't go deep. Or maybe they go deep, but they can't go wide. But like really what you need is like it's a bit of both.
Yeah, yeah, definitely. It's a really good point. And I've seen people make that mistake so many times of, they're a tiny kind of seed stage company and they go and hire the person from the number one market leader in the space who are 1,000 people, and it just doesn't work at all.
Yeah.
So something that I've noticed from working with mParticle is you not only have really good people in your business, but a lot of them have been with the business for a long time. We're talking 4 or 5 years, and they've seen progression up, the ladder in that time. And this industry, the average tenure is like 1.5, 2 years probably. So I guess my question is like, how do you do that?
Yeah. But even more specifically, like on my executive team now, we have me, my brother, who are both co-founders. We've been here 11 plus years, 12 years. Excuse me. Our SVP of engineering has been here 11 years at this point. Our chief customer officer has been here 7, going on 8 years. Our other co-founder has been around the business, since inception. Our head of sales has been here nearly 5 years. So like 4 or 5 is probably on the low end for the folks that have like. We still have every member of like our founding engineering team, like the team
Wow.
that built V1 of mParticle. And I think what it is like you give people a canvas to go out and succeed. Like I was just having this conversation with somebody else. It's like the opportunity to succeed and to grow is all around us. Like, do you take the initiative to go out and take advantage of it or not? Right. And like how much agency do you operate with? Because I think for me that's probably like the single biggest defining characteristic between people who've been successful and not successful here is like how much agency do they operate with when they run into problems or friction. And everybody will at some point, even I do. What do they do about it? Do they just like say, okay, that's how it is, and I'll just kind of go back to doing whatever I was doing, or do they steamroll through? The best employees find a way to steamroll through it. So I think part of it is looking at, okay, if that is true, how do we reverse engineer that? And that becomes the values discussion. That becomes the discussion around how you start to deliberately form culture. You want to go out and you want to hire high agency people. How do you do that? Look for people who do like DIY projects, right? Like that shows that like they actually have a bias for action, for doing something on their own when they don't really have to. Like if somebody spends most of their time watching like reality TV, I would bet against that person. Right. It's kind of like having this like hacker mindset, right? Like is that person able to demonstrate a way where they were able to create a solution to a problem, even if the solution wasn't overly elegant? If they took the initiative to solve the problem, to me that says like, okay, innately there's a ton to work with.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. No, it's a fascinating point. I hate reality TV, by the way, just for the record. Cool. So just kind of, we've got a couple of minutes left here. I think one final question I've got is kind of tying everything into go to market, really. So from a kind of GTM strategy perspective, are you of the mindset of let's come up with a strategy and then hire the right people into roles who fit that strategy? Or are you more a case of I'm going to hire the best people who I really back and then give them the agency and autocracy to kind of develop the strategy as they go?
Um, Yeah, that's actually a really good question. I've seen it done both ways. I've done it both ways at times. I think part of my answer would be like it is context specific. Um, and it's also, I think, um, it kind of depends on like the level of seniority. I think like for executives in the executive level, you really can't take like risks on bringing in executives that like aren't an incredibly strong fit. Um, if if you do and they don't work out, like the results can be catastrophic because of how much impact they can have that kind of cascades throughout the organization. And we've been there. Like I've seen it. I've lived it. We've moved on from it. Um, you know, like you have to be able to bring in people that understand the context, have situational fluency, and can make the people around them better. That's at the executive level. I'd say at the maybe director level and below, I don't think that that's quite the case. I think what you want to look for is aptitude as well.
Mm,
Probably more so than experience, because again, everything is kind of context specific, and like um, the way that you do things at your company is probably different than the way that they did things at the previous company, and you want to look for the innate ability to like read and react and thrive in those situations versus somebody who's like, yep, I've done that, I've solved that problem. But if you were to peel back the layers of that problem, was the go-to-market strategy exactly the same across companies? Was the product strategy the same? Like, were the resources and constraints the same? Like, you start to like decompose it. It's like, no, these things were very different. So you're looking for that like that raw horsepower ultimately.
yeah, yeah. It's another great answer, MK. And honestly, you've given so much insight here. I feel like we've barely scratched the surface. So we might have to get you back in season 2 for a second visit. But
Perfect.
yeah, I really appreciate all the answers there. Just as a way of wrapping up, we're gonna try to get each guest to come up with a question for the following guest. So the next person we'll have on will be similarly a founder or a GTM leader of a Martech scale up. What kind of are you always interested in learning, or what would you want to find out from someone like that?
Um, to me, it's all about the system. All right, what have they learned about creating a system where the whole is greater than the sum of the parts, and what part of that system have they been able to derive the most leverage from?
Cool. Perfect. Fantastic. Well, that's the end of the time there, MK. Thank you so much for coming on the podcast today. It's been a great pleasure to have you on.
Yeah, thanks for having me, Ben. Great to see you.
Nice one. And for those tuning in, thanks for listening. Watch this space for the next episode of Go to Martech.